They made us laugh until our sides ached, brought joy into millions of homes, and created television magic that still sparkles today. But behind the bright studio lights and infectious laughter of I Love Lucy lay a tapestry of heartbreak, betrayal, and devastating tragedy that would ultimately claim each beloved cast member. What happened to Lucy, Ricky, Ethel, and Fred when the cameras stopped rolling? The truth is darker than anyone could have imagined. In 1951, when I Love Lucy first graced television screens across America, it seemed like pure magic had been bottled and broadcast into living rooms everywhere. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz weren't just playing husband and wife, they were living it, breathing it, creating something unprecedented in television history. But little did the world know that even in those golden early days, the seeds of destruction were already being planted. Behind Lucy's rubber-faced antics and Desi's charming Cuban accent lay a marriage already fracturing under the weight of fame, infidelity, and impossible expectations. Vivian Vance, who would become beloved as Ethel Mertz, arrived on set carrying her own burden of disappointment on once promising Broadway career, now reduced to playing the frumpy neighbor, and William Frawley, the cantankerous Fred, harbored resentments and personal demons that would eventually consume him. The show's phenomenal success created an illusion of happiness that masked the growing tensions. Each Monday morning, as the cast gathered for table reads, they were unknowingly stepping closer to their individual tragedies. The laughter was real, but so was the pain that each performer carried in their hearts. The magic they created together would become both their greatest triumph and, in ways they couldn't foresee, the source of their deepest sorrows. The irony was devastating. While millions of Americans found comfort and joy in their weekly antics, the very people bringing that joy were slowly unraveling. The bright Klieg lights that illuminated their performances also cast long, dark shadows that would eventually engulf them all. What began as television's greatest love story would become its most tragic tale of love lost, dreams shattered, and lives forever changed by the very fame they had worked so desperately to achieve. Lucille Ball was supposed to be the indestructible force of television comedy, the red-headed queen who could make any situation hilarious with just a raised eyebrow or perfectly timed pratfall. But beneath that flame-colored hair and those expressive blue eyes lay a woman drowning in heartbreak, desperately trying to hold together a crumbling marriage while the entire world watched. The public saw Lucy as the bumbling but lovable housewife, whose schemes always backfired in the most entertaining ways. What they didn't see were the nights when Lucille would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of her Beverly Hills mansion, wondering where her husband really was. Desi's infidelities weren't just rumors whispered in Hollywood corridors, they were an open wound that bled throughout their marriage, poisoning every moment of happiness she tried to grasp. During the height of the show's success, Lucille was living a double life that would have made any of Lucy Ricardo's deceptions pale in comparison. By day, she was America's sweetheart, the bumbling wife who worshipped her bandleader husband. By night, she was a woman consumed by jealousy and suspicion, hiring private investigators to follow Desi, confronting other women, and slowly losing herself in the process. The pregnancy episodes that made television history were born from Lucille's desperate attempt to save her marriage. She believed that having children with Desi would finally anchor him to their family, would make him choose love over the endless parade of chorus girls and starlets who threw themselves at the Cuban Casanova. But even as little Ricky was born, both on screen and in real life, generating unprecedented publicity and ratings. Desi's wandering eye never stopped roaming. The final seasons of I Love Lucy were filmed under a cloud of barely contained anguish. Lucille Ball, the woman who could make millions laugh with a single glance, was slowly dying inside, her marriage becoming a performance more elaborate and heartbreaking than anything Lucy Ricardo ever attempted. The queen of comedy was wearing a crown of thorns, and the weight was becoming unbearable. Desi Arnaz was the American dream, not a Cuban refugee who had clawed his way from poverty to become one of television's most powerful producers and most beloved stars. His accent made him exotic, his smile made him irresistible, and his business acumen made him wealthy beyond imagination. But behind the conga drums and the infectious Lucy, I'm home, lay a man whose demons would ultimately destroy everything he touched, including the woman who loved him most. The tragedy of Desi Arnaz wasn't that he was a villain, it was that he was a man incapable of appreciating the treasures he possessed, until they had already slipped through his fingers. His childhood in Cuba had been marked by revolution, exile, and the kind of instability that breeds both ambition and an inability to truly trust in permanence. When success came, he grasped it with both hands, but he couldn't seem to hold on to love with the same desperate determination. Lucille Ball wasn't just his wife and co-star, she was his salvation. The person who believed in him when Hollywood saw only another Latin lover stereotype. She fought for him, protected him, and built their empire alongside him. But Desi's gratitude was overshadowed by his need for conquest, his compulsive pursuit of other women becoming an addiction as destructive as any substance. Each affair wasn't just a betrayal of Lucille, it was a betrayal of the family they had built together. both biological and professional. The man who created the modern television rerun, who revolutionized the industry with innovative camera techniques and production methods, couldn't innovate his way out of his own self-destructive patterns. The same charm that made him irresistible on screen made him magnetic to women everywhere, and he lacked the strength, or perhaps the desire, to resist temptation. His success became his downfall, providing him with endless opportunities to betray the one person who had made it all possible. As I Love Lucy reached its peak, Desi was already planning his escape from the marriage that had made him a star. He couldn't see that in destroying his relationship with Lucille, he was also destroying the very foundation of everything he had built. The Cuban boy who had lost everything once was about to lose everything again, this time through his own choices rather than the whims of history. When Lucille Ball filed for divorce from Desi Arnaz in 1960, it wasn't just the end of America, it was the shattering of America's most beloved television fantasy. For 9 years, Lucy and Ricky Ricardo had represented the perfect American marriage, passionate, playful, and enduring despite every obstacle. The revelation that the real-life couple behind these characters was splitting up felt like a personal betrayal to millions of fans who had invested their hearts in the fairy tale. The divorce proceedings revealed the depth of the devastation that had been hidden behind the laughter. Lucille's testimony painted a picture of a woman who had endured years of humiliation, infidelity, and emotional abandonment while maintaining the facade of happiness for the sake of their career and their children. The private investigators' reports, the confrontations with other women, the nights spent wondering when her husband would come home, all of it spilled out in painful detail. Desi, for his part, seemed almost bewildered by the consequences of his actions. He had somehow believed that he could compartmentalize his life, keeping his affairs separate from his love for Lucille and their family. The realization that his behavior had destroyed the thing he valued most came too late. His attempts at reconciliation were half-hearted and ultimately futile. The damage was too extensive. The trust too thoroughly shattered. The financial dissolution of their empire was almost as painful as the emotional breakdown. Desilu Productions, the company they had built together from nothing, had to be divided like any other marital asset. The studio lots where they had created television history became bargaining chips in a bitter legal battle. The woman who had helped create the modern television industry found herself having to fight for her fair share of what she had helped build. The children, Lucy and Desi Jr., became unwilling witnesses to the destruction of their parents' marriage. The same cameras that had captured little Ricky's birth now seemed to document the death of their family unit. The irony was devastating. The show that had celebrated family values and marital love had been built on a foundation that was already cracking, and when it finally collapsed, it took everyone down with it. While the world focused on the spectacular breakdown of Lucy and Desi's marriage, another tragedy was unfolding in the shadows: the slow, painful destruction of Vivian Vance's spirit and career. The woman who had brought Ethel Mertz to life with such vibrant comedy was herself dying a little more each day, trapped in a role that had become both her salvation and her prison. Vivian had arrived in Hollywood with dreams as bright as any starlet's. A classically trained actress with Broadway credentials, she had envisioned herself in dramatic roles, perhaps even films that would showcase her considerable talents. Instead, she found herself cast as the dowdy, perpetually frustrated neighbor, whose primary function was to be the butt of jokes about her weight, her appearance, and her marriage. The role that made her famous also became the cage that confined her. The real tragedy of Vivian Vance wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Her marriage to Philip Ober was crumbling under the pressure of her success and his resentment. He couldn't handle being Mr. Ethel Mertz, couldn't accept that his wife had achieved the kind of recognition that had eluded him throughout his own career. Their fights became legendary among the cast and crew, bitter arguments that echoed through the studio halls and left Vivian drained and demoralized. The weight requirements written into her contract were perhaps the cruelest blow of all. CBS insisted that Vivian maintain a certain appearance to preserve the comedy dynamic between Lucy and Ethel, essentially forcing her to sacrifice her health and self-esteem for the sake of laughs. The woman who should have been celebrating her success instead found herself trapped in a cycle of self-denial and body shame that would plague her for the rest of her life. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Vivian's tragedy was how thoroughly she was overshadowed by Lucille Ball's star power. Despite being equally talented and contributing significantly to the show's success, she was always introduced as Lucy's co-star, never as a star in her own right. The supporting role that had made her famous had also made her invisible, and she would spend the rest of her career trying to step out of Lucy's shadow, never quite succeeding. William Frawley came to I Love Lucy as a broken man trying to piece his life back together, and he would leave it even more shattered than when he arrived. The veteran vaudevillian who brought Fred Mertz to life with such cantankerous perfection was himself a study in disappointment, alcoholism, and the cruel passage of time that had left him watching younger, less talented performers achieve the success that had always eluded him. The irony of Frawley's casting was both perfect and tragic. He was essentially playing himself a cranky, cynical old-timer who had seen too much of show business's dark side to maintain any illusions about its glamour. His natural bitterness translated beautifully into comedy, but off-camera, that same bitterness was eating him alive. The man who could make audiences laugh at Fred's penny-pinching ways was himself terrified of poverty, hoarding his money and living in constant fear that this success, like all his previous ones, would prove temporary. His relationship with Vivian Vance became the stuff of Hollywood legend, but not in a good way. Their mutual dislike was so intense that it sometimes threatened to derail entire episodes. Frawley resented having to work with what he considered a Broadway snob, while Vance found his crude behavior and casual misogyny increasingly intolerable. Their scenes together crackled with authentic tension because, in many ways, they genuinely couldn't stand each other. The tragedy of William Frawley was that he had finally found the role that could have defined his career in a positive way, but he was too damaged to fully embrace it. His alcoholism, which had destroyed previous opportunities, continued to be a problem throughout the show's run. There were mornings when he arrived on set, reeking of booze, afternoons when his hands shook too badly to handle props, and evenings when he disappeared into the bottle to wash away another day of pretending to be happy. That is, I Love Lucy ended, and the cast went their separate ways. Frawley found himself once again facing the uncertainty that had plagued his entire career. The steady paycheck was gone, the regular routine was finished, and he was left with nothing but memories of what might have been. The man who had helped create one of television's most beloved families was himself utterly alone, sustained only by his bitterness and his increasingly frequent trips to the local bar. The end of I Love Lucy in 1957 should have been a celebration, a triumphant conclusion to one of television's most successful runs. Instead, it felt more like a funeral, with each cast member walking away from the Desilu lot carrying the weight of dreams deferred, relationships destroyed, and opportunities that would never come again. The show that had brought so much joy to the world had extracted a terrible price from those who created it. For Lucille Ball, the end of the show marked the beginning of the end of her marriage. Without the binding force of their professional partnership, the personal relationship with Desi had little left to sustain it. The woman who had been America's favorite wife was about to become its most famous divorcee, her personal life playing out in tabloids and gossip columns for the world to dissect and judge. The final episodes were filmed under a cloud of barely contained emotion. Everyone knew that something precious was ending, but nobody could have predicted just how complete the devastation would be. The chemistry that had made the show magical was still there, but it was tinged with sadness, like watching a beautiful flower bloom even as its roots were being poisoned. The wrap party was a subdued affair, far removed from the usual Hollywood excess. The cast and crew, who had become a family over 6 years, found themselves struggling with goodbyes that felt more permanent than anyone wanted to admit. Promises to stay in touch were made with the kind of desperate sincerity that suggested everyone knew they probably wouldn't be kept up. As the studio lights dimmed for the final time on the Ricardo apartment set, an era was ending not just for television, but for the four people whose lives had become so intertwined with their fictional counterparts. The laughter had stopped, but the real tragedy was just beginning. The curtain had fallen, but the final act of their personal dramas was still to come, and it would be far darker than anything Lucy Ricardo had ever imagined. After the divorce, Lucille Ball found herself in an unprecedented position. She was now the sole owner of Desilu Productions, making her the most powerful woman in television. But power, as she quickly discovered, was a cold comfort when wielded in solitude. The empire she had built with Desi became a magnificent but lonely kingdom, ruled by a queen who had everything except the one thing she had always wanted most: someone to truly share it with. The studio lots that had once echoed with their shared dreams now felt cavernous and empty. Lucille threw herself into work with the desperation of someone trying to outrun her own heartbreak. She greenlit groundbreaking shows like Star Trek and Mission Impossible, proving that her instincts were as sharp as any male executive in Hollywood. But each professional triumph felt hollow without Desi there to share in the victory. Her attempts at finding love again were complicated by her fame and the impossible comparison to what she had lost. Gary Morton, the comedian she would eventually marry in 1991, was a kind and stable man who offered her the security she craved. But he could never be Desi, could never match the passionate, turbulent love that had defined her most vital years. Their marriage was comfortable rather than consuming, safe rather than spectacular. The children, Lucy and Desi Jr., became both her greatest joy and her deepest source of worry. She could see Desi in their faces, could watch his charm and charisma emerging in their personalities, and it was both wonderful and heartbreaking. She became fiercely protective of them, perhaps overcompensating for their father's increasing absence from their daily lives. As the years passed, Lucille Ball became more legend than woman. Her image crystallized in the amber of I Love Lucy reruns. New generations discovered her through syndication, but they were falling in love with Lucy Ricardo, not Lucille Ball. The real woman behind the character was increasingly isolated by her own mythology, trapped in the same way that had once confined. Vivian Vance, the queen of comedy, had become comedy's prisoner, forever expected to be the zany redhead who had stopped truly existing decades earlier. After leaving I Love Lucy and eventually losing Lucille, Desi Arnaz discovered that success without love was just another form of failure. The man who had conquered television found himself increasingly conquered by his own demons, became his constant companion, and regret his most faithful lover. The Cuban boy who had once dreamed of America found himself living in a nightmare of his own making. His post-Lucy career was marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to recapture the magic he had thrown away. Other television ventures came and went without making any lasting impact. The innovative producer who had revolutionized the industry found himself unable to innovate his way back to relevance. Each failure was a reminder of what he had lost, each setback a reflection of the decision that had cost him everything. Relationships that followed Lucille were shallow imitations of what they had shared. Desi married Edith McHirsch in 1963, but it was a pale echo of his first marriage, where Lucille had been his creative partner and intellectual equal. Edith was simply a companion, someone to share his declining years but not his dreams. The passionate love affairs that had destroyed his marriage to Lucille now seemed meaningless and empty, conquests that had cost him his kingdom. His health began to deteriorate in the 1970s, weakened by decades of heavy drinking and the stress of carrying so much regret. The heart problems that would eventually claim his life seemed almost metaphorical heart that had been broken by his own choices, finally giving out under the weight of what might have been. The man who had once been the picture of vitality was slowly fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. In his final years, Desi would often speak about Lucille with a mixture of love and anguish that was painful to witness. He had finally gained the wisdom to appreciate what he had lost, but it came too late for redemption. The charming destroyer had become his own victim, and the tragedy of Desi Arnaz was that he lived long enough to fully understand the magnitude of his mistakes, but was powerless to undo them. After I Love Lucy ended, Vivian Vance found herself in the peculiar position of being both famous and forgotten, recognized everywhere she went, but unable to find the kind of substantial roles that would showcase her considerable talents. The success that should have opened doors instead seemed to have closed them. Typecast as the frumpy neighbor who existed only to make Lucy look good, her attempts to break free from the Ethel Mertz persona were met with resistance from both the industry and the public. Audiences wanted to see her recreate the same character dynamics. Executives were unwilling to risk casting her against type, and Vivian herself struggled with the confidence necessary to demand better roles. The woman who had once commanded Broadway stages now found herself begging for television guest spots that were pale imitations of her former glory. The physical and emotional toll of maintaining the Ethel character had been enormous. The weight, requirements, the unflattering costumes, the constant jokes about her appearance, all of it had chipped away at her self-esteem until she barely recognized herself. In her post-Lucy years, she tried desperately to reinvent her image, but the public's perception was set in stone. She was Ethel Mertz, and Ethel Mertz she would remain, regardless of her own desires or capabilities. Her personal life offered little solace. The divorce from Philip Ober had been messy in public, another Hollywood marriage destroyed by the pressures of fame and ego. Her subsequent relationships were marked by the same patterns: men who were initially attracted to her celebrity but ultimately resentful of her success. The woman who had brought so much joy to others found herself increasingly isolated and lonely. The saddest aspect of Vivian Vance's post-Lucy years was how thoroughly she was overshadowed by her former co-star's continued success. While Lucille went on to other television shows and remained in the public eye, Vivian faded into semi-obscurity, remembered primarily as a supporting player in someone else's story. The talented actress who had deserved so much more became a footnote in television history, her contributions minimized and her struggles largely ignored. William Frawley's post-Lucy years were a slow, sad fade to black, marked by increasing isolation, worsening alcoholism, and the bitter realization that his greatest success was behind him. The man who had spent his entire career as a supporting player continued in that role even after the show ended, relegated to smaller and smaller parts in a business that had little use for aging character actors. His next major television role came in 1960 with My Three Sons, where he played the grandfather figure Bub O'Casey. It was steady work and provided him with some financial security, but it was also a constant reminder of what he had lost. The ensemble camaraderie of the Lucy cast was replaced by a more conventional workplace dynamic, and Frawley found himself even more isolated than before. His relationship with alcohol, always problematic, became increasingly destructive as he aged. The steady work on My Three Sons was threatened multiple times by his drinking, and he lived in constant fear that his latest bout with the bottle would be his last. The man who had always prided himself on his professionalism was slowly losing the battle with his demons, and everyone around him could see it. the loneliness was perhaps the most crushing aspect of his decline. Never married to the love of his life, estranged from what family he had left, and unable to form meaningful friendships due to his prickly personality and drinking problems, Frawley spent his final years in almost complete isolation. The man who had been part of television's most beloved family was himself utterly alone when he suffered his fatal heart attack on March 3, 1966. Walking down Hollywood Boulevard after a movie, it seemed almost symbolic. The vaudevillian who had spent his life performing for others died alone on a street corner, far from any stage or studio. His death barely registered in the media, a sad footnote to a career that had touched millions of lives, but left its owner ultimately unfulfilled and forgotten. The tragedy of I Love Lucy didn't end with the original cast. It seemed to spread like a curse to the next generation, particularly affecting Desi Arnaz Jr., whose life became a cautionary tale about growing up in the shadow of television immortality. The child who had been born into America's most famous family found that fame was both a blessing and a burden that would define and distort every aspect of his existence. From the moment of his birth, which had been synchronized with little Ricky's arrival on the show, Desi Jr. was public property. His childhood was documented by photographers and reporters, his teenage years scrutinized by tabloids, and his young adult mistakes magnified by a media machine that seemed to take pleasure in the downfall of celebrity offspring. The pressure was enormous and unrelenting. His struggles with substance abuse began early and would plague him for decades. The son of the king of comedy and the queen of television found himself unable to live up to the impossible standards set by his parents' success. Every attempt at carving out his own identity was measured against the towering achievement of I Love Lucy, and inevitably found wanting. The weight of that legacy was crushing. His romantic relationships became tabloid fodder, particularly his highly publicized affair with Patty Duke, who was several years older and dealing with her own psychological issues. Their relationship was a train wreck played out in public, with both parties using it as a form of self-medication for their respective traumas. When Duke claimed that Desi Jr. was the father of her son Sean, it created a scandal that followed him for years, even after DNA tests proved otherwise. The music career that had shown such early promise became another casualty of his inner turmoil. The band, Dino, Desi, and Billy, had achieved significant success in the 1960s, but Desi Jr.'s increasing unreliability due to his drug use eventually destroyed that opportunity as well. The pattern was always the same: initial success, followed by self-sabotage, as if he were determined to prove that he was unworthy of the family name he carried. Lucille Ball's final years were marked by a poignant mixture of triumph and tragedy, as she continued to work and entertain, even while her body and spirit were slowly failing. The woman who had once been television's brightest star found herself increasingly isolated by her own legend, surrounded by people but truly known by very few. Her last major television venture, Life with Lucy, was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. The 1986 series was intended as her triumphant return to television, but instead became a painful reminder of how much had changed since her glory days. Critics savaged the show, audiences stayed away in droves, and Lucille was forced to confront the reality that her time had passed. The cancellation after only 8 episodes felt like a rejection, not just of the show, but of her entire legacy. Her health problems mounted as she entered her 70s. The woman who had once been able to take any physical pratfall was now fragile, her legendary energy depleted by age and heartbreak. The comedy that had once come so naturally now required enormous effort, and everyone around her could see the strain, but she continued to perform because it was all she knew, the only identity she had ever truly claimed. The relationship with her children remained complicated. Lucy had followed her mother into show business, but struggled to establish her own identity separate from the Lucy legend. Desi Jr.'s problems with drugs and alcohol were a constant source of worry and heartbreak. The woman who had played America's most loving mother found herself unable to fix her own family's problems. Despite having all the resources success could provide, her final public appearance was at the 1989 Academy Awards, just weeks before her death. She looked frail and tired, a shadow of the vibrant woman who had once commanded the television screen. But when she smiled, for just a moment, the old Lucy magic was still there. It was a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost and a testament to the strength that had sustained her through decades of triumph and tragedy. While the world mourned Lucille Ball and remembered Desi Arnaz, the deaths of Vivian Vance and William Frawley passed with far less fanfare, reflecting how thoroughly they had been overshadowed by their more famous co-stars. Yet their endings were no less tragic, perhaps more so because they faced their final struggles largely alone and forgotten. William Frawley's death in 1966 was as lonely as his final years had been. The heart attack that claimed him on Hollywood Boulevard was swift and final, ending a life that had been marked by nemesis and almost. He died as he had lived, as a supporting player in someone else's story. The newspaper obituaries were brief, focusing more on his role as Fred Mertz than on the complex troubled man behind the character. The funeral was a small affair, attended mostly by colleagues rather than friends. The absence of genuine mourners spoke to the isolation that had defined his later years. The man who had been part of television's most beloved family was buried without fanfare, his passing barely noticed by an industry that had already moved on to younger talents and newer stories. Vivian Vance's death in 1979 was equally understated, though she lived longer and had more time to come to terms with her legacy. The cancer that claimed her was fought with the same determination she had brought to her performances, but in the end, it was a battle she couldn't win. Her final years had been spent in relative obscurity, appearing occasionally at Lucy reunions and fan events. Always gracious but clearly diminished. Her friendship with Lucille Ball, which had been complicated during their working years, had evolved into something deeper and more genuine in their later lives. Lucy's presence at Vivian's funeral was one of the few times the public saw genuine emotion from the comedy queen, a reminder that behind all the show business artifice were real relationships and authentic grief. The tragedy of both William and Vivian was that they had contributed significantly to one of television's greatest achievements but were remembered primarily as footnotes to Lucy and Desi's story. Their individual talents, struggles, and contributions were overshadowed by the larger narrative of the show's success and the star's spectacular personal failures. Today, more than 7 decades after I Love Lucy first aired, the show remains a testament to both the power of laughter and the price of fame. Millions still discover Lucy's antics through reruns and streaming services, finding joy in the same moments that were created by people carrying so much private pain. The contrast is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Art transcending the suffering of its creators to bring happiness to generations they would never meet. The apartment at 6023 East 68th Street still exists in our collective memory, frozen in black and white perfection. Lucy's schemes still make us laugh. Ricky's exasperated Spanish still charms us. And Fred and Ethel's bickering still feels authentically married. The fictional family they created was more stable and loving than any of the real relationships behind the cameras. A beautiful lie that became more true than the truth itself. But knowing what we know now about their real lives adds layers of poignancy to every episode. When we see Lucy batting her eyelashes at Ricky, we remember Lucille desperately trying to save her marriage. When Ricky sings Babalu, we recall Desi's talent being overshadowed by his personal demons. When Ethel delivers a perfectly timed insult, we think of Vivian struggling for recognition. When Fred complains about money, we remember William's fears about his financial future. The curse of I Love Lucy was that it set an impossible standard for happiness that none of its creators could maintain in their real lives. They had created television's most perfect marriage, most loving family, and most loyal friendships. But they couldn't sustain those ideals when the cameras stopped rolling. The pressure to live up to their fictional selves may have been part of what destroyed them, yet their legacy endures, not despite their tragedies but because of them. They poured their pain, their hope, their desperate need for love and acceptance into their performances, and that raw humanity is what still moves us today. They may not have found the happiness they sought, but they gave happiness to millions of others, and perhaps that's a form of immortality worth the price they paid. The tragic endings of the I Love Lucy cast remind us that behind every perfect television family lies imperfect human beings struggling with the same demons that haunt us all of jealousy, addiction, loneliness, and the desperate need to be remembered. Their legacy is complex. They created something beautiful that has brought joy to countless people, but they paid a terrible personal price for that creation. Perhaps the real tragedy isn't that their lives ended sadly, but that they never fully appreciated the magic they had created together. While they were living it, they were too consumed by their personal struggles to recognize that they were part of something immortal. Their laughter echoes across decades, their chemistry remains undimmed by time, and their influence on television comedy continues to this day. In the end, the cast of I Love Lucy achieved the one thing that most artists only dream of. They created work that will outlive them, bringing joy to people they never met in times they never saw. If there's redemption in their tragedy, it's this, that their pain became our pleasure. Their struggles became our smiles, and their love, however complicated and flawed, became eternal through the medium of television. What do you think? Did the price of fame destroy the very thing that made I Love Lucy so special? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if their story moved you as much as it moved us. Subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age, where the brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows.